Stephen Shield is a forestry expert who spent much of the past 20 years helping to pioneer eucalypt plantation techniques in South America.
We must grow eucalypts to get more value out of them, more value per hectare. And the business of growing trees is the business of growing money. And to grow money, I think we have to appreciate that we need nice big trees. And to get nice big trees, we have to apply the right silviculture. So I'm a silvicultural evangelist, if you like, with the eucalypts.
The sermon is espousing the virtues of a relatively new, seemingly radical plantation regime which dictates a massive reduction in the density of plantation trees.
What I'm preaching these days is lonely trees. Trees that are sufficiently separated in space from one another that they need a cell phone to communicate one with the other. Trees that don't compete with one another become fat trees, and fat trees are higher value trees, and that's what we have to do, and we have to do it quickly.
Eucalypt plantations in Tasmania are almost exclusively planted to produce pulpwood. It's biomass operation where the fibre of the trees is important, but not so the form.
So this is your typical plantation. It's a blue gum plantation. It's about 5 years old, and it's planted so there are about 1,100 trees to the hectare. And while that's very good for growing pulpwood, it's less good for growing saw logs.
Whereas in your plantation with lonely trees, we can be down to as low as 200 trees per hectare. That means that in 25 years' time, the trees are big, fat saw logs worth much more money.
This Forestry Tasmania stand near Geeveston in the state's south is one of the first Australian attempts at a lonely trees plantation. And the message here is be bold, thin early and prune hard.
I think you have to be careful about the proximity of trees that you leave as retained stems.
Yep.
Here we've got two trees 1.5 metres apart, thereabouts. And up here you've got crowns that are in competition with one another.
Yes.
And this means that the trees are going to grow out, and you'll get growth stresses developed on the inside of these trees. Besides which, when trees compete, they slow down in their diameter growth. So my suggestion would be that one of them would have to go, should have gone, and that you need to keep the trees well separated so that they can grow laterally and uniformly in their crowns.
Yes.
And this means the diameter will follow.
Now the lonely tree plantation philosophy, Andrew, requires some heavy thinning when the trees are relatively young, and as we understand it, there are a couple of ways to do it.
Nick, you've got to be ruthless. One way is an obvious way, and that's just with a bloke with a chainsaw.
Yep.
Go along, pick out your tree, lop it down. The other way that we're playing around with in Tasmania is ejecting the tree with some sort of poisony substance.
But does it no good?
The tree then falling over in sort of 3 to 4 years' time. There's pros and cons for both. Manual thinning with chainsaws is fairly labour intensive, not to mention hazardous for those in the bush doing the job, while poisoning involves the use of some nasty chemicals and leaves the dead but standing trees in the plantation for a number of years. Both methods are being trialled.
So that way we can compare the different sites, because we've also got to look at the cost. Early work in these plantations means a greater cost at the end because it's money invested early. So we've got to look at the most economic and operationally best way of doing it.
So after the first couple of years in this particular plantation regime, you come through, Hardy, and you pick the trees that you do not like and you cut them down.
You do, Nick. You thin them out. You've got to be cruel to be kind. These trees that you cut down are actually good for nothing. You can't use them for anything, but by getting rid of them, these trees behind will grow up bigger and stronger and quicker.
These give so that they may grow.
That heavy thinning has other follow-on effects. With the trees spread so far apart in the plantation, grass grows quite happily between them. Once the trees have reached a reasonable size, livestock can be grazed on the pasture to further add to the productivity of the land.
It happens that growing lonely trees under a trees on farms policy is a real doddle. It's a piece of cake because it's almost exactly what the farmer wants. He doesn't want a dense mass of shade that precludes co-cropping with pasture, for example. He wants the ability to grow grass underneath trees and lonely trees suits that ideally. And in fact, in the north of Argentina, there are some brilliant examples of lonely trees and fat cattle going together.
After the break, we'll look at the lonely tree's implications for our sawmilling industry.
Plus, still to come, proving that dirt breathes, and an unlikely win-win for the environment and four-wheel drive nuts.
Almost all eucalypt plantations in southeastern Australia were conceived to produce wood for the pulp industry, but now the lonely trees idea is catching on as a way of propagating high-quality sawlogs. Tasmanian miller Britain's Timber is at the forefront of the new regime. There is a difference when you look at it. On this side, Sean, we've got the old style or normal style plantation where you plant a bunch of trees, leave them alone, come back and harvest it in 20 years.
Yes.
On this side, the new regime.
Yes.
What's it mean to you as a sawmiller?
Well, this means prospects of growth in our industry over time, because we know that this isn't going to produce saw logs, but over here, from what we've seen, it's going to create good quality saw logs in 25 to 30 years, which is on top of our current native forest resource, and it can mean extra volumes for our industry, which has got to be good for Tasmania.
Sawlog plantations should guarantee continuity of timber supply to millers, something which the current native forest strategy is less likely to offer. It will also produce the same size trees in shorter time, using less land to do it.
If you look at if you're comparing it to native forest, our native forest regrowth that Forestry Tas harvest and supply us with saw logs at the moment, you're probably looking at an age of somewhere between 50 and 80 years old. We're looking at growing similar diameter to saw logs in 25 to 30 years.
In South America, the first of the lonely tree plantations are about to start delivering a return to investors, and the scale is impressive.
They've just commissioned a sawmill that processes 400,000 cubic metres of these high pruned saw logs that are 25 years old from this regime. That's bigger than the entire Tasmanian sawmilling industry. And so we want to be looking forward, our industry wants to be looking forward 20 to 30 years time and saying, okay, we can be doing this sort of stuff as well. We've got good growing conditions, we've got the species, let's get some trees in the ground and manage them for plantations.
One of the benefits of having Forestry Tasmania with substantial external consulting business, and also with lots of world-renowned scientists, is we tend to capture most of the good ideas, implementing them sometimes a bit more challenging. But again, a group of very experienced Tasmanian sawmillers also went and looked at some of these regimes in Portugal, Spain, Uruguay and Chile, where they grow Tasmanian blue gum. And they grow regimes that produce really high quality sawn timber output. So again, I think we need to pick up the best of what other people have done, the best of what we've done, and with doing both those things, I think we can find a much better environmental and jobs and regional development outcome.
So next time you drive past a eucalypt plantation, see if you can pick it as a pulpwood or sawlog operation. If the trees are far apart and look a bit lonely, chances are they're on their way to becoming high-quality sawlogs in the next 25 to 30 years, and that will give the sawmilling industry the kind of security it hasn't had in decades.
All right, throughout each episode of Going Bush, we're giving you the chance to experience Tasmania's newest forest experience, the Tahoon Airwalk Lodge. And at the end of the series, you could win a fantastic major prize thanks to Forestry Tasmania and innkeepers.
Each week, one lucky winner will win a night's accommodation at the Airwalk Lodge for a family of 4, including free entry to experience the iconic Tahoon Airwalk.
And at the end of the series, one lucky winner will win the ultimate Tasmanian adventure holiday, including family passes to all of Forestry Tasmania's adventure forest sites and accommodation at Innkeeper Properties, Quest Launceston, Tall Timbers and Quest Trinity House.
All you need to do is write down this week's forest code word and enter via the FT website at www.forestrytas.com.au.
Time now on Going Bush to turn up the intellectual heat, Andrew.
Yes,
and that's
Nick.
why I brought you here to Warra. This is in fact a research station out in the forest.
Nick, it's State Forest which has been set aside to conduct experiments. Look, that's not a van, it's a science lab in the forest. Today, we're looking at carbon. Carbon accounting has become something of a buzz phrase since the whole climate change debate got rolling, and this Melbourne University PhD study is aiming to measure the surprisingly large amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases being produced by forest soils.
The soils are living, basically. If you were to strip away the minerals, there'd still be most of the soil there, most of the bacteria, the fungi, the invertebrates that are living in the soil. There's a massive community down below the ground, all chewing on the roots, the litter that falls to the soil. They're basically cycling that through, and they're respiring all the time they're doing that.
The 9-month study consists of a delicate web of tubes, traps and analysing equipment, and for the first time is giving us a more complete picture of the forest's carbon exchange cycle.
And so, Tim, this is part of the experiment that measures the breath coming up from the soil.
That's right, Nick. The lids of these chambers will close up. When they close, the machine sucks a sample of the air up into the van where they measure the gases that are released from the soil.
It's not just the soil that is breathing, it's also the logs that are lying on the forest floor. I'm joined by Dr. Simon Groves, who describes himself as a deadwoodologist. Mate, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at rotting logs and their role in the carbon cycle on the forest floor here.
How quick for a log to rot?
Well, that was a question we set ourselves. It's a difficult one to answer because in this sort of forest we don't know how long these logs have been on the ground in the first place, and so it's a real detective story to try and come up with those numbers.
So there's carbon being stored in those logs, but there's also carbon being released?
Yeah, that's right. They store a huge amount of carbon, but in terms of releasing it, it's all the creatures that are living in there that are breathing away, decomposing the log, and they play a very prominent part in the carbon story for the forests here.
It's a dirty job. Cool climate eucalypt forests have between 100 to 500 tonnes of dead wood per hectare, and determining how quickly that wood is decaying is key to accurately accounting for the amount of carbon being released.
We use chainsaws to chop up about 200 or 300 logs to look at the rots inside them to start with, and then we have to take samples of all those rots and take them back to the lab to work out the carbon content. But then in terms of figuring out how long these logs have been on the ground, we need to use a range of approaches. This log here, for instance, has got myrtle trees growing out of it, and you can take a core to those myrtle trees. So you can take a core sample, and use the tree rings to work out how old the myrtle tree is, and from that gives you a minimum age for the time since the log arrived on the ground.
The upshot is that decomposition times are longer than previously thought, a decent sized log taking a good 200 years to finally break down.
To start with, we didn't think we knew very much because we didn't. And if we had just taken results from other people's studies in the tropics or in the Northern Hemisphere, we would have been way out. So it's very appropriate that we do this research locally, and it's telling us a different story from other parts of the world.
So in the carbon sort of accounting, Hardy, we've got not only the ground respiring and the logs rotting away, we've also got water.
Nick, to do a big picture carbon cycle, we've got to take into account all manner of things, including how much carbon is running away in the rivers. Research Officer Ian Riley has spent plenty of time looking at just that question. The process of sampling and analysing creek water running off a particular catchment area has provided a first look at the part played by water in the carbon cycle.
Ian, so my sample is drinking water, not much colour. Yours is from the creek.
Yeah, and we've used the colour as a means to give us an indication as to how much carbon is contained in the water.
So colour, in this case, is carbon.
Yes.
And you might be surprised to learn just how much carbon is carried away in that light shade of yellow.
In terms of over a whole year, Warwick Creek behind us is exporting 100 tonnes approximately of carbon out per year out of this catchment area, and the forest itself would be absorbing about 1,000 tonnes from the atmosphere into itself per year for a catchment of this size.
It all adds up to a clearer, more accurate assessment of the carbon impacts of our forests and the ability to use that knowledge to better manage them for future challenges.
We can understand, for example, how the forests are responding to particular weather events like droughts, wet years, dry years. What's the difference between a wet year and a dry year, and how much the forests are absorbing carbon versus how much they're releasing? What happens when there's an insect outbreak, defoliating insects? How much does the forest lose carbon during those events? And by knowing those specific events, we can then look into the future and look elsewhere to see, well, how are these events going to change in the future with, say, climate change or areas that are more prone to insect attack? What's going to be the consequence on the amount that forest can store carbon?
So to sum it up, even if it just looks like dirt, forest soils are alive and definitely breathing. Rotting logs add to the carbon production side of the ledger, but more slowly than expected, and water exports a fair whack of forest carbon to elsewhere in the ecosystem, and there's no doubt that knowing all this will become more and more important to the forest industry in the future.
And still to come, four-wheel drivers and forestry blazing a trail of responsible recreation in the bush. Time to get off the beaten track now and going bush, Nick, and we're looking at a community agreement between Forestry Tasmania and four-wheel drivers.
Now, in the past, Andrew, four-wheel drivers have had a bit of a dubious reputation, but this new agreement is aiming to address some of those concerns.
It's the image of four-wheel drivers tearing up the bush and trashing the roads that this partnership is helping to address. In an Australian first, management responsibility for 9 forestry tracks has been given to Four-Wheel Drive Tasmania in return for sustained access to the area.
What promoted this into occurring was the fact that four-wheel drivers lost the use of an iconic area at Southport Lagoon, and on the back of that there was much hoo-ha, and four-wheel drivers said we need somewhere of a similar ilk to go and recreate. So I approached Forestry Tasmania because the other instrumentalities that were concerned with accommodating us seemed unable to get their head around what it was we were requiring, and Forestry Tasmania greeted us with open arms.
It was a bit of a gamble, I've got to say, because we weren't sure which way it'd go. But I've got to say that, like everything in our community, you get small groups of people create the issues, but there's a large group of people out there that do a really good job, and what we've seen today and through this program is fairly typical of that.
And while entry to state forests is free to all and usually unrestricted, getting to those more challenging sections of old disused track is the real benefit to serious off-roaders.
Some of the tracks are not as accessible for conventional vehicles as others, and they're probably older tracks that now are not used regularly, but are suitable for four-wheel driving. Some of them are rougher than others, which some of our members enjoy. So it's roads that are not normally accessed by the general public.
This particular community agreement is a win-win for both sides, Nick. Not only do the four-wheel drivers have a place to go on four-wheel drive, they actually take responsibility for the tracks, which includes cleaning them up.
Management, the issue of rubbish in state forests is a pretty significant one. Seems that as soon as local councils put up their tip fees, a vast amount of rubbish ends up in the bush.
It's disgusting, dirty.
Every 6 months or so, the four-wheel drivers tow their trailers into the forest for the thankless task of lugging out tons of illegally dumped waste. But just being out in the bush can help deter other, potentially more serious crimes.
Big area, like down here we've got 123,000 hectares, and when vandalism happens, these fellas are out there when we might have arsonists about. They're good for intelligence from that point of view as well. So we skin a lot of cats with this program.
The tracks around the Huon area here, Nick, range from something that you could drive the family car on to some very challenging four-wheel driving.
There certainly are, Hardy. 120 or so kilometres here, but it's not just four-wheel drive groups who are benefiting from these community agreements.
So far, fishing, horse riding and mountain bike clubs have struck shared responsibility agreements, and their members are enjoying the greater access that goes along with them, and in return committing to protect the forest environment.
We're governed by a Forest Practices Code and other environmental legislation, so to sanction any action on the state forest we need to be happy that those actions are within those guidelines.
Go out and enjoy your four-wheel drive without trashing the forest, without trashing the tracks, without bogging the tracks up, and use them in a responsible way and enjoy them.
The partnership agreement between FT and Four Wheel Drive Tasmania is an Australian first. Clubs manage and maintain the tracks in return for sustained access, and other organisations that use state forests are encouraged to strike similar arrangements.
We meet the world's biggest freshwater invertebrate and chart its journey back from the brink.
Look at some of the ways to spend or save $1 in our forests and when wood becomes art, the world of special species timber. That's next time on Going Bush.